Hey everybody, how you doing? It's Mark Ross, ITK Radio. Joining me today from Nashville, Tennessee, Abraham Williamson. It's hard to believe, I was an adjunct professor at GW. One of my brightest students ever, Harvard Law graduate. Oh my God, smartest kid ever. Abraham, how you doing, buddy? What's happening?
I'm doing excellent. Thank you for having me. And it does seem like just yesterday I was sitting in your class at GW learning about globalization and commanding heights and all that good stuff. So it's good to see you now, all these years later.
Oh man, you warm my heart, man. Commanding Heights, that's like my go-to, man. It's like on loop in my house. That's like my favorite. That's like my favorite book and documentary. I love it. I'm glad that made some kind of impression. Um, Hey, I think I want to chat about what you're working on now. You're kind of at the intersection of technology. You fashion yourself as a startup founder, attorney, which is really interesting. Um, just talk about what that's like, what that role is, who your clients are, and then we'll do a deeper dive and what's happening in the VC tech world.
Yeah, absolutely. So a corporate attorney, I guess by training, and then got more niche into venture capital. So that essentially means that we're finding companies right when they start. Like we have clients that have spun out of university business school classes, other people who have been working on their project for a
Wow,
minute, others who, are building and have been building for the last couple of years, but now they're like, okay, it's time to raise some money and some capital to get behind this because we've been flying around our drone or putting our machine out there in the garage. Now it's time to really get some backing behind it. And there's a big difference between a services business and a venture backable business, right? Both can be good businesses, but with venture backable, you're really saying, hey, we want an infusion of millions of dollars so that we can grow incredibly fast. And that means you need certain systems in place. Things are going to break, but you want people on your team who can help guide you. Lawyers are just one component of that. So we help people not just make sure that their legal house is in order for due diligence, but also onboard employees and contractors, sometimes offboard them, help them figure out how to divvy up stock. And then when it comes to the actual agreements with their IP and working with vendors and suppliers, we're helping them to negotiate that as well. And then a lot of our clients work across states, so we're helping them to navigate entering new terrain.
amazing. You sound more like an MBA than a JD. How did you get so smart on the business side of it? Did you get exposed to that, or when did you know, like, hey, I want to go into VC law?
I think you're being very generous. Fortunately, I had a couple opportunities to take some classes in the business space. If that's what you're hearing, don't really think about it that way. But in law school, there was an opportunity to take an online business course. And then once I started at my firm in New York, I worked at a firm representing a lot of Wall Street clients. They actually brought in a business school for a business education program for about 3 or 4 weeks. The firm invested, I think, $1 million into making sure that we got smart in that regard. But I think having the Diverse Tech Founders Media podcast is what really helps because I've interviewed over 50 founders and investors so far and asked them about their business. And we're in the ecosystem. So a lot of the advice that I get and hear on the podcast, I just kind of repurpose it and use it with my clients to the extent they ask about that kind of stuff.
No, I absolutely love it. Yeah, the ecosystem. I totally want to dig in on that, and then I want to talk about because you're in Nashville, which is obviously one of the hottest cities in America, but I don't think traditionally been seen as like a hotbed of kind of technology. Obviously, Vanderbilt's a great school. The music industry. There's great companies in Nashville, but obviously your experience in Boston and New York City, why Nashville? Like, how did you end up there? Was it like a market fit, a niche, or you just like, listen, this is my part of the world. I want to like the rise of the rest, what Steve Case talks about. How did you end up in Nashville?
I think it was a life fit more than anything. I'm
Yeah,
originally from North Little Rock, Arkansas, and during the pandemic, I was living, at least initially, my best life in New York City right before the world kind of changed forever. And I went to visit my parents for a weekend, or what I thought was a weekend, and that turned into 7 months. And I decided to pivot my practice away from private equity and into venture capital and move back to the South. And Nashville was a close place to my parents, but also a pretty good and burgeoning ecosystem. I wanted to be in an environment where I felt like I could grow and make an impact and also spread their message and evangelize more broadly. And when I first got to Nashville, I heard the same thing, not traditionally seen as a VC hub. And to the extent that there are tech companies, 80% of them are in the healthcare space.
right.
So I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
that's changing with the people coming in, but that's been my experience. And it actually does have a lot of solid aspects that could make it a stronger ecosystem in the future, like different organizations that are contributing. It just needs more money coming in, I think.
I think what's interesting about like the Nashvilles of the world. So I grew up in Michigan and Ohio, and I think a lot about cities like obviously Columbus or what's happening in Detroit and Ann Arbor with the University of Michigan. But then I think about like what's interesting is these cities that have state capitals, right, as well as like NFL teams, and and a great university. I think when you have like these kind of like the ecosystem in Nashville is like super interesting. Like what's happening in Atlanta, state capital, NFL teams, great sports, great universities, right? I think about like Denver, what's happening out there, and there's like these really like in some ways like these second and third tier cities in America are just such a hothouse of activity, and tapping into that has probably been very fortunate because you're bringing elite East Coast knowledge to the rise of the rest, the growing South. How are you experiencing that?
It's been good. And I remember reading a book about America's sort of different nations historically. And I think being from the South helps because when I first got back, I was working at a firm downtown and I just went for lunch one day. And I know it's a very big difference between walking the streets of downtown Nashville versus, Midtown in New York, where people were commenting, "Oh, you look nice. I like the way you're dressed. I like your suit." People are a little bit more vocal. But I also think the culture is different in the sense that, at least this book was arguing that we're sort of in like Appalachia culture in Nashville, where people historically were used to sort of defending their property. There weren't, neighbors, but, miles and miles away. So people just developed a different culture. And I think
Right.
that culture is different. But being born and raised in the South, I think it definitely helps. But also, Nashville, I'll say two things on this. One, when I go into different events in the city, somebody will ask, how many people have moved to Nashville in the last 2 years? And like half the room will raise their hand.
Yeah, it's like
And I think
it's
that's,
insane, right?
about 50% of the people I would say that I encounter are coming from elsewhere. In fact, when I first got here, the Uber drivers would say that, the Californians and the New Yorkers are driving up the prices because it's a bargain to folks coming from the coast, and more people are taking advantage of it.
Tell me about the I think a lot about culture and ecosystems, how important they are, and the ability, yeah, as a son of the South, is like being, that's like where you grew up, how important that is, and how do you use that as a differentiator when you're talking to folks? I mean, whether you're seeking new clients or as you're interviewing people on your podcast, do you use that as a tool to say, listen, man, like we're from the same part of the world, I understand what's happening, let's do something great?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there's a part of that, but what I found is that even stronger is being able to connect with people from where they are. With the podcast, season one was all over Zoom, mostly the people that I knew in New York and London and Atlanta. But season two, I've been traveling more, and now season three, been traveling more. So I just drove to Orlando. I drove to Detroit. I was in Dallas, San Francisco, Houston, Kansas City, Miami, and most recently started interviewing people overseas again as well, particularly in Abuja, Nigeria. And what I found there is that there's an advantage in being able to take a step back and peel back. Okay, regardless of where you're from, there's something that we understand, and other people will let you know about the differences. You don't have to rush to judge what those differences are. But I think being, quote unquote, a son of the South does help being back here, because even though I have the New York tag on me, I think people get a sense from my accent and just how that I've been moving in the space that I kind of understand the social mores in a way of how
Right,
the
right.
South works, and am able to kind of push it at just the right speed.
Yeah, I have this philosophy. I when I talk to executives about communications, this idea of like global street smarts. Like, obviously, it's important. Most everybody we deal with is like well credentialed and smart and has seen a lot of crazy stuff. But the ability to little things like, yeah, where's the best place to get a cocktail in Detroit? Like, what's the best way to travel by train in and out of Paris? This kind of like street smart knowledge that really only comes from being on the ground, being out and about, meeting with people, is a huge skill. And I think I encourage a lot of executives to, you know, be a normal person, right? Get into the streets, walk around, have some conversations, try some different restaurants. Yeah, no, I love it. I love hearing that you're actually, traveling, seeing people face to face.
It makes a huge difference. And I'll often ask the founders or investors, like, where do you like to hang out? So in Houston, we recorded an episode in the Ion. In Kansas City, we went to their downtown space that the city government has been investing in. And you just get a sense this is your kind of daily life. This is where people are congregating, because when you talk about ecosystem, it is space, and being where people are moving, you can kind of see if it's really built for people to collaborate, or if it's just sort of a building. And I'm finding more and more that cities are being intentional about making it a space where people feel invited.
Yeah. Talk to me about, obviously, we're in the same kind of business, like in the service space, we're helping folks solve, business problems. I'm really interested. I mean, I think a podcast is a great tool because it, gives you all kinds of opportunities. Tell me like how you're using the podcast and thought leadership and communications to differentiate yourself, and also to increase your knowledge and get exposure to maybe other folks. Maybe you'd meet them, but it'd be a much more drawn out process by saying, hey man, do you want to come on my pod and have a conversation? How you're using that as a business tool to raise your profile and to help your firm grow.
Yeah, I think it's all of those things, for sure. I think it helps to build credibility when I'm speaking with people and they're like, why should I trust you? Who are you? Where do you get your, credibility from? It's now easy to point to the podcast as a reference point and say, you don't have to take my word for it. Here, 50 people, and you can go listen to those conversations and what they sound like. I also think, like you said, in terms of access, people may not say, hey, can I come and pitch you for legal services? But they, for the most part, are going to be open to having a conversation on the podcast and getting introduced to, a few hundred, hopefully thousands of people in the future. And it's not always sort of a hard sell, but when you get in the room with people and you sit down with them for an hour or an hour and a half, some of our interviews have been 2 and 2.5 hours, you just feel closer to them. And even if it doesn't translate into business, for me, I've even had folks who have come onto the podcast who end up investing in my clients because they're interested. They say, hey, if you know anybody, let me know. So I use it less so for downloads now and more as building a roster of people who are willing to work together and help each other. And I ask them that before they come on, if they would be willing to be reached out to and connect with other guests.
Oh, that's good. So that's one of your prerequisites. You're using it also to almost build a community, your own little ecosystem and network.
For sure. My goal is to have, our old friends become new friends with each other. So it's gratifying to hear when people have connected offline, or they're like, yeah, I catch up with this person every month. And I'm like, I don't even talk to that person that often, but it's cool to see that relationships grow and develop.
How did you settle in? I mean, there's obviously tons of ways to communicate, right? I mean, you could obviously get interviewed yourself. You could write opinion editorials. You could do a book. Why did you settle on the podcast or kind of Zoom videos to conduct your quote unquote thought leadership?
Well, back in New York, first of all, I think I should say I had no connection to venture capital. I didn't know a venture capitalist. I didn't know a startup founder. I didn't know what vesting was. I didn't know, how equity worked in any sense of the word when I came out of law school. But a friend from undergrad was founding a fintech company, and I went to the firm to see if they would be open to it. But, it was kind of coming out of the blue. I was still in training. And so a year later, when they closed their Series A round, I went back to them to see if we could throw an event for them in Harlem. And so that event brought in 50, 60 people, some who were deep in the game, others who were new, some who were a plus one, didn't even know what the event was for. And after that event, people said, I like the atmosphere that you're cultivating. You should keep it going. And so I just continued to throw those events until the pandemic made that untenable. And I had a choice to make. Am I going to stop building the community, or am I going to attempt to keep having these conversations, which ultimately the podcast seemed like a good medium. At the very beginning, it was not good. I mean, the guests were great. I wasn't. And there
Yeah, I
was a
mean, like
huge
anything, you got to get in the
we had a,
reps, right? You got to go to Hamburg and do some shows. Yeah.
but it got better over time. And I think I took it a bit more professionally. And I wanted to ask questions that not everybody gets. So, like, the first question is maybe a bit intense, but it's like, talk to us about your childhood self. And if childhood you would be friends with you today. And the goal is for people to really talk about their losses. I get feedback from people who are listening, and they're like, yeah, it's great, but sometimes you're a little soft on people. We want to hear the struggle. So one of the founders who came on the podcast ended up building a company to $1 billion in value. And they talked about, being in the Denny's and, sort of getting kicked out. They had run out of money. They had to close that investor. They weren't going to make it. And people preferred that story to it's been great since the very beginning.
Yeah, that any entrepreneur who said it's been great from the beginning is probably not telling the entire truth. But yeah, there's probably more like in Ohio, man. Bob Evans is the big restaurant. So there's like the economic engine of Bob Evans is like off the charts. Like that's where a lot of commerce gets done. So yeah, I could see being in a Denny's, eating some eggs, trying to figure out what the hell you're gonna do. Tell me about how you use the pod and kind of this network with you when you went. Like, how does your employer see it, or how does your team see it, or the firm? Do they see it as an extension? Are they encouraging it? Like, and talk about, I guess, creative types like founders or service people like yourself that are making the leap, or they want to join a bigger firm, but they have this kind of creative side. Can you just talk about how you navigate that with your either a future employer, or,
For
joining a
sure.
firm?
For sure. So I think, initially when you're starting, if you're at a place, it may be a bit more difficult. When I moved to Nashville, Tennessee, I let the firm I was moving to know up front, hey, I have this, this company, Diverse Tech Founders, and I have this podcast. And, I asked them to carve that out of things that we were negotiating. And so they knew coming in that I had it. I think there's always the fear that you're devoting not fully your time and attention to the company. So I think you have to be aware of that. But as long as you're performing at a high level and people know up front, and in fact, some of the lawyers that I worked with, they were encouraging. They listened to it as well. They thought it was an opportunity for me to develop business. And I will also say that the firm was good in that sense. Not every law firm is going to, want their associates to be spending their time building business. For some law firms, they already have that work in business. So for me, it was a good fit at that point in my career to have those be aligned. And now that I own my own firm, we sort of decide what is, what's appropriate. And I think it's just been synergistic. People enjoy having a voice that they can hear and learn from more that they don't get charged hourly rates for.
Yeah, for sure. And as you're building this network, I imagine you're being, I don't say bombarded, but challenged, or people in the community are like, hey, Abraham, can you do, a multi-day conference? Can you do this? Can you start getting to publishing? And how you wrestle with the opportunity or what the market is telling you versus like, hey man, like this is like one part of my business and like I'm doing 5 other things, and making sure that this thought leadership piece stays true to itself without getting diluted and expanding. Or how you think about that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think about that in terms of capacity. So time is limited for sure, but not necessarily the systems that you could have in place. And I haven't been the best at that, but kind of like when we were throwing we called them app launch parties in New York, I didn't have a whole bunch of time to be, hosting events and parties, but someone who attended that first event helped me to systematize it to where I could basically just pull down the templates and go. He helped me to build a system. And I've been attempting to do that in other areas. I think the law firm is ripe for that, to just have those in place to free up some more time. But in terms of separating them, I think folks know that that's sort of my priority is, helping my existing clients. But I'm happy to be a part of the ecosystem. And when I do get invited to be a moderator or a speaker, if I can do it, I will make it work. And even if that means I have to stay up and get a little bit of sleep, I know we were talking about that before. Right now, I'm still sacrificing sleep. Maybe that will change one day, but that's where I'm living now.
Let's talk about, obviously, before we got in here, I was telling you I'm a 52-year-old, white dude, middle-aged guy, battling all this stuff. Let's talk about diversity, man. Like, what should I
Yeah.
know about diversity? Like, making me smarter about that topic and what that means, and like maybe what I'm missing, when I hear that phrase.
Yeah. Well, I think we maybe have a good discussion on that because I'm probably missing some things too. But if you let me indulge a little bit, because I did go overseas for grad school, particularly with this idea in mind, like, how can we communicate across difference? And when I did, I searched far and wide. Initially, I was very, into the critical perspective. That was what I knew from college. I think a lot of people come into college and they get hit with that ideology, but I realized that it was sort of found wanting for me in the sense that it necessitated a polarity. I needed somebody to be different and resistant to me for my worldview to make sense. So I started
Right.
looking for something else, particularly in countries that have dealt with conflict and tried to come out of it. So countries like South Africa and Germany. And in South Africa, I came across an interesting professor who was African, but was teaching at an Afrikaans school and spoke Afrikaans, spoke Zulu as well. And you take what you can from different people, but this idea of mutual vulnerability really resonated with me. And that was essentially, if you're in a powerful position, and I think it's safe to say, like you said, 52-year-old white male, there's some power there to recognize to recognize that the people on the other side of it, have some various different struggles, right? Like you're going to have to bridge the gap in some way. But also, if you're in a powerless position, also recognize that the dominant person in that interaction is also going to be dealing with some psychic things as well, maybe guilt, maybe shame that they're going to have to give up too. And since I've left grad school, I adjusted that slightly from mutual vulnerability to a mutual authenticity. One, because people felt like vulnerability was weakness. And I think authenticity is really the game. We're posturing always with power to not reveal too much. And I think the biggest thing that I can say is if you are in a dominant position, whether it's white man, whether it's, a straight man or what have you, to not lie to the other team or not gaslight them in that way and to be authentic about it. So that's what I would say on the diversity tip. So when people come on to the podcast, that's the vibe. Go ahead.
No, so when you lead with the authenticity, I mean, you got to be a bit vulnerable, I guess, in the sense like, I mean, you should say, hey man, I have questions, or I want to learn, or I don't know everything, or, this is my worldview. And that, like, it's interesting you mentioned like shame and guilt, but the idea of like, I guess, making yourself vulnerable to saying, hey, I don't know everything. I'm curious. I'm interested. I don't have all the answers. And I may ask dumb questions, but, let's make sure this is a safe place where we can have a good conversation.
It is. And I also think, we get caught up in the particular differences. And to me, that is a recipe for a limitation. And I'm not saying that I'm limitless at all, but if you truly have like justice in mind and you're going to take the perspective of really anybody in that situation, then I think you can find yourself being able to challenge people who seem to have the upper hand politically in some instances, because you're coming from a position of justice. Because we have a tendency as human beings, if we're in a vulnerable position, to try to really bring that home and twist the screw a little bit. But again, the philosophy is different from critical, which is, you're different, so let me just flip the script on you. Now it's, if I didn't know who I was going to be, after we work all this out, how do we actually want to build our society? We don't want people necessarily bullying each other. We don't want people mistreating people on the basis of color. If that is your foundation, then when you have conversations, yeah, you might get stuff wrong, but your underlying sense of justice should come through. And I think people respect that.
So I think sometimes too, I don't know if you feel this way, but like there's a cliche around diversity, like just being diverse for the sake of diversity, as opposed to being like, listen, man, like, especially in the tech space, to me, or any business now, I mean, I tell people, like, as soon as you're on the interweb, like on the internet, like you're global, right? Like, and your service can be applicable, and, like, and I also tell people, listen, I think it's good to kind of push yourself, and yeah, let's do some commerce in Nigeria. Like, it might not be easy, but it's going to help you in your market to get exposure to other folks and other markets and other cultures. But also, like, having this idea, like getting back to the global street smart idea, like it helps to have knowledge about different cultures and different ecosystems, even here in the US. So the diversity thing is, do you find that, I mean, do you worry that it becomes like a cliche, or it's a box checking kind of thing? Like people are just saying it to do it, but they haven't really said, or they haven't embraced what it really means to them.
Absolutely. I don't necessarily get into, people who are doing diversity wrong, but at least, what it means to me is that you're acknowledging that, something has to change and new people need to sort of be invited to the table. And, what's interesting too is, and I know you didn't necessarily ask this question, but even if you think about the growing topic of like reparations, right?
Right.
Which, I am sort of in favor of. I think if you look at the past, it's very clear that Black folks, something needs to be done there. But when I look at how I move in the space with that idea in mind and in support of it, is that how am I going to ask for something that I'm not also giving? So I do give up my time. I donate my time to various different people and causes, and that's the idea of reparations, is you're willing to take a step back and give a little bit more. So on the diversity front, I learned that in college because I was on the debate team, and my partner was a brilliant woman from Birmingham, Alabama, and I was over talking her as a freshman and as a sophomore because I was like, this is the way that I want to win. But I had to learn how to work on a team and recognize that our differences actually made us better, and that her being more like me or me being more like her wasn't a recipe for success. The recipe for success was finding a third way that incorporated both of our strengths. And so whether it's, gender or race or what have you, I think diversity is this idea, of, taking a step back so that other people can step up, and also giving them an opportunity to have the tools that you have if you can do that.
Yeah. Speaking of tools, let's chat about, obviously the US is a huge market, biggest market in the world, a lot of opportunities here, and how you like advise founders or firms that, are concentrated in the States, but maybe they should take a flyer. Like you mentioned Nigeria. I'm super interested in that because I've been wrestling with this idea. Like I want to, like, for lack of a better word, like adopt, a country in Central America, adopt a country in Africa, and just like get into it, man. You know what I mean? Like whatever that is. Cause I think me personally, it would help just be more creative and learn about stuff, but also, um, invest in other parts of the world. But at the same time, there's underserved communities here and, in the US. So talk about wrestling with that, the need to like provide opportunity in the States, but also maybe in Africa, Central America, et cetera.
Yeah, that's a really good topic, and I think it's one that doesn't have a quick answer to it. I do think you can do both. Obviously, you're going to be splitting your resources a bit, but I think for me, when I think about interacting with people in other countries, one is learning about really what's happening there. They're going to know better than you because, I remember when I was traveling back and forth to South Africa when I was in graduate school, there were a group of Americans there, and they mentioned, hey, we came to school and we gave, this kid a gift, and another kid got a little bit upset about that, and the gift came because he was hurt, and so another child intentionally hurt themselves so they could receive that gift. So sometimes you think you're helping, but if you really don't understand the landscape, that's not the best. If you can connect with leaders in those cities who align with your kind of ethos, I think that's a way where you can really kind of spearhead it, because they're going to be able to multiply their impact. So if you have $1 to spend, I won't necessarily say 50-50 or put one in your country and one in another, but I do think whenever you have an opportunity to help, like on that call with the various people in different countries, because we do also serve in our law firm clients in Nigeria, Germany, Denmark, and
Right.
when you have those opportunities to step up, don't say, oh, I don't want to give this because it's going to hurt back home. I think it's less about trying to pick the winners and losers, and more so when people show up, who are you with them? And whoever comes to me, I'm going to help them. And I tell my clients that all the time. I'm like, I'm not on their team because you're on my team. This is how we're going to do it, because we're together. Because I realized a long time ago, you're not going to be able to please everybody. So especially when I was in law school, I was the treasurer of the Black Law Students Association, and I realized that the third of the people are going to rock with you. They're going to like you, maybe even love you. A third of the people are not going to like you no matter what you do. And then a third of the people may not care that deeply either way. So my goal is to just satisfy the third who was in support, and the third who was on the fence, I think, respected that. And that's how you get to a majority of people.
Yeah, I want to. Yeah, I think the running clubs, or even like any kind of politics, even the microcosm, of running a college club is like a good lesson. And obviously, you went to school in DC, you worked on Capitol Hill, and I find I don't think enough business people spend enough time having any kind of understanding what's happening in government and the role it plays, or even having any kind of exposure. I mean, this is a totally leading question, but do you think that spending any time in DC or on Capitol Hill has helped you, giving you a different horizon? And do you think more people should spend time volunteering on campaigns and getting to know their elected officials?
Absolutely, for two reasons, and I had to plug your class again because you were really giving us the game back in the day, and it helped. I mean, it's one thing to be on the hill and to be around it. It's another thing to have a unified ideology about how trends work, so you can recognize them, on the horizon, not just when they're happening. And for me, working on Capitol Hill, it made you a whole lot sharper. You're able to recognize people who are being upfront and truthful, also people who, even if you don't describe them as being deceptive, you know that there's some self-interest there, they want something. And I think that's true in society. It's just it's hyper focused and concentrated when you're dealing with stakes as high as they are on Capitol Hill. So I actually think that there's a good parallel with Capitol Hill and Wall Street from a culture. They're different because the government, has, a lot of power. It's a different type of work environment from Wall Street. At the same time, if you don't understand the politics of it, you're going to find yourself isolated and you're going to find
Yeah.
yourself without resources, and one person can make or break you. So Capitol Hill teaches you how to build alliances and coalitions with people. It teaches you how to play the long game, maybe sacrifice a battle for an overall campaign. So I would definitely encourage people to do it. And I think even in terms of your career, people see Capitol Hill on your resume and they know that you can handle pressure.
You at least handle a bunch of yahoos, man. That's for sure. Tell me before, as we wrap up here, I want to talk to you about like just how capital is allocated. I was actually joking with somebody the other day, like, some of these apps, and maybe these are some of your clients, so I apologize in advance, but like they're just making burrito delivery better or faster, or online reservations. But should we be spending more money in biotech space? I mean, wrestling with like capital allocation versus capital return. You know, where do you see? Are you pleased with the way capital is being distributed, or where it's being invested, or do you think that as Americans we're like foolishly over investing in certain sectors?
That's a big question, and I won't necessarily tell people how to spend their money. What I can say is that there are a number of clients that I've seen in the ecosystem who have really cool ideas, and from the beginning, they've had people in mind, like they're mission oriented. They know that it's valuable, and they don't want to. I mean, they've seen the stories of people having their company taken, so they're very aware of making sure that it makes financial sense. But there are plenty of opportunities to invest in people who have really mission driven ethos, even in stuff that's kind of tricky like space or policing. There are companies out there that are building technology to help bring people closer together. So in terms of capital allocation itself, it's disappointing that so few of those dollars get allocated to people who don't fit the traditional profile. We were talking about diversity before. I think
Right.
in 2020 there was a lot of capital that was promised and allocated to different founders, but now we're seeing actually lower numbers than it was, the prior year. So there's an opportunity there. The question is how. So one of the things that we do is not just say, "Hey, you're black, please, get money, or you'll get money just because you're black." It's how can you make yourself undeniable? Again, going back to the debate team at Howard, that's what our coach taught us. They were just like, regardless, you're going to have to be undeniable. And so that's what we work with our founders on, and also building more connections to people who share that ethos, because the venture capital industry, as I'm sure your space is as well, is very relationship driven. And if you're
Yeah.
getting 1,000 pitch decks a day, seeing an email from somebody saying, "Hey, take an extra look at that," is valuable. So one of the things that I'm also selling, in addition to trust as a lawyer, is also social capital and an opportunity to connect with people that might be difficult to get a hold of.
Let me, yeah, I get two questions I want to like quickly talk to you about. Like, if you're a budding founder, or you want to like, you've got a great idea, what's your advice about how to get noticed, right? Whether it's in Nashville, Atlanta, New York, Detroit, whatever, just within the local community of kind of venture capitalists or maybe angel funders, and then your advice to how to approach an attorney. I mean, that is got to be fairly daunting. I imagine you have folks that you are like, listen, man, I can help you, but then the relationship hasn't started. Like, talk about those two things, like getting noticed within like kind of the angel community in your local town, and then working with a law firm or attorney.
Yeah. So in terms of getting noticed, I think the first and foremost thing to always keep in mind is your customers. People are going to take notice of you if other people have. And that doesn't mean other investors need to have necessarily, but if you're building something or you have an idea and you have 2, 3, 4, 5, 10,000 people who are like, yo, I would have this, I would love this, I would take this, that's going to be stronger than I think going and saying, hey, I have this really good idea, please listen to me. If you can say, hey, we actually don't even need the money. The customers are willing to pay us, $200 up front to build this thing. We just want you because we think you can help us get to the next level.
Yeah.
That's more attractive. It's like what they say with banks. They're going to lend the money to people who don't need it. So I think you really have to lean in on the customers. And that's what, we talk to our clients about. If you're struggling or not getting enough traction with investors, when was the last time you talked to your customers? Like, how often are you talking to them? Even as a lawyer, if I haven't heard from some of my clients in a minute, I'm going to reach out to them and say, hey, is everything good? How are things going? And typically with that circle back, you're going to get a conversation started that oftentimes does lead to, some activity. So customers first. And then the second question was
just about how to approach get to know an attorney or approach a law
lawyer.
firm, or just what's the first step? I mean, just general advice for a founder.
Yeah, I think tapping your network is important. A lot of the folks that we come into contact with are by referrals, but also, one, I get it. You're going to have some hesitation and some skepticism with lawyers because, the profession has a reputation for not necessarily for your bills getting higher than you expected. But I think I've learned a lot in this process, and I think if you have a couple $1,000s, $2,000 that hey, I'm going to spend this on legal for sure to get this right, then I think you put yourself in a better position because lawyers like myself are going to be willing to work with you. If you work with startups, you know that it's up and down. But that's how I would approach it, to say, hey, these are the issues I have. And now that I'm talking, there's one more thing that I would say. On that initial call, just be organized. And when
Yeah.
I'm coaching other people or on the phone with them as they're talking to other lawyers, um, it's not time for you to sort of give a summary of what's been happening or what's up. What your goal is to really say enough for the lawyer to identify some issues. So tell them, hey, I'm starting this company. I haven't issued any stock to anybody. I have people working, but they don't have agreements. Just try to look at it from the perspective of a lawyer if you can, so that they can see what work actually needs to be done. Because if not, and this is true in technology too, I see this a lot in technology too, Mark. If you're not clear up front, there will be changes, and those changes will cost more money than you thought.
So in some ways, yeah, having a conversation is like, here's the current state, but my goal, my future state, like where I want to go is X, Y, and Z. Can you help me get there? So really, that's really good advice, as opposed to being complaining about, what's happening or where you are, but really like, listen, man, both of our time's valuable. Abraham, I think you can get me to X, Y, and Z. Yes or no?
That's right. And those calls often go quickly and the work gets started and gets completed, pretty timely.
Love it. Hey, as we wrap up, anything you're reading or watching, it can be, something frivolous or fun. It can be something serious, like Commanding Heights, great book. Everybody should read Commanding Heights. Anything you've been kind of gnawing on and enjoying lately?
It is a great book. Well, I'll say two things. On the book front, I started rereading, but really reading in full for the first time, the 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene, which has some really good excerpts from other books on strategies. And it's been super helpful just to think about your life from a more longitudinal perspective. In business, you're going to have situations, right? You like your people, and it just helps you to understand yourself better, and also when to take a temporary loss in order to get a greater gain, and how to just generally protect yourself more in environments of high stakes. And then in terms of podcasts, I've been listening to The Diary of a CEO a little bit more. It's had some really good episodes, some really good interviews on there. I don't know if
That's
you've come
yeah,
across
that
it.
guy's out of the UK, right? Is that am I
He
thinking?
is, and he is, and I just like the initial podcast. I was searching for ways to sort of monetize mine, and his approach was like, okay, I even chunked the idea of monetization and went more to, let me listen to what these people are saying. And I know there's different stuff out there about this particular individual. I think he's on the equivalent of Shark Tank in the UK,
Yeah,
but I
Dragon's
enjoy,
Den, or yeah.
yeah, but I enjoy his interviews. I think they're really thoughtful, and it's pushed me to be a better journalist myself because he really does a deep dive into the guests.
No, I love you're doing 2-3 hour podcast, man. You're like Castro, man. Like, that's amazing.
It's been good, and people get going. I start with 21 questions. I don't always ask them, but you know you want to get to know somebody. And I had been I broke them up a little bit, and I have been part one, part two. And people are saying that they actually like the longer episodes. They like to really get to know somebody full length. So we might keep doing that.
I like too, like you're right about Robert Greene. Like his books are very approachable in the sense like you don't have to read them concurrently. You know, you can kind of dip in, dip out. They're almost like episodic. I mean, yeah. I mean, he says like 33. Like he's got the 50 laws. Like there's something about, for me, I respond very well to those kind of vignette books where, you know, because for me, at any given time, I'm probably reading 5 books, and you know, I mean, so yeah, I think Robert Greene, that's spot on. That's a great call. I actually haven't read that book, so I think I'll order that today. Good stuff. All right,
That's
buddy.
awesome.
How can people find you? How can people get on your podcast? Are you accepting pitches, or do you have
Yeah.
your producing team working full time at CAA, like, you know, coordinating all that? Are you talking to Netflix yet?
It's not all that. It's not all that. But yeah, feel free to reach out. My personal email address is where most people end up sending the requests. It's Abraham1.Williamson@gmail.com. That's how people can just email me, and I will respond. Um, and then, follow the podcast itself, Diverse Tech Founders Media on all platforms. I'm also on LinkedIn. That's probably the easiest way to get in touch with me. People randomly reach out and I do respond, and we get on the phone that way. So either of those two options would lend itself to connecting.
I love it, man. I appreciate taking the time. Before you go, what country are you bullish on? Like, where should we be looking?
That's a good question. Are you talking about to live or to invest? What do
Well,
you
it could
mean?
be either, man, to live or to just like, hey, there's some cool stuff going on here. Pay attention to. Like, it could be, you know,
Okay. Well,
there's no wrong answer, man.
no, you're good on that. So, so we have a few clients and growing actually in Nigeria, and I was watching like a population trend in the future, and I think Nigeria is going to surpass the U.S. in population at some
Oh
point
yeah, the
this century.
numbers, like the demographic numbers, are off the charts.
And they're really sharp entrepreneurs over there. They really are. Although, if you listen to the podcast, you'll hear people who have spent time in Nigeria. I haven't so far. They'll give you their take on the variety of experiences that you might have there. But with the entrepreneurs that I've spoken with, they've all been really sharp and they've all been knowledgeable. Like they're asking for the U.S. perspective, but they've already done their research. They've already done their homework. They really do kind of study what's going on this side of the pond. So I would say definitely look at that. And then the UK, I know it's very similar perhaps to the US, but what I like about the UK is that their startup ecosystem, some people may see it as a disadvantage, but it's really centralized and concentrated in London. In the
Yeah,
US, we have New York, Miami, San Francisco, Austin. They're spread out and disparate, and people communicate across, but to me, it's different than London, where basically all of the folks kind of know each other in that same space, and there's a lot more flow back and forth. Because I attended angel investing school in the UK with Andy Ayim, who was recognized by the Queen before she passed away for his work in diversity in the UK. And I've just seen in the last 3-4 years them just explode in terms of opportunities. So I would say the UK and Nigeria are two places I would keep an eye on.
no, you're right. And just from a transportation hub, I mean, obviously there's a lot of travel between London and Nigeria, and you know, I always tell people too, like from the East Coast, from like DC, London is only like another 90 minutes. You know, it's like it's not much further than flying to LA. I mean, you know, so and I do like, yeah, I've been really interested in these kind of super city ecosystems, and yeah, London checks a lot of boxes. You know, finance, government, easy transportation. So no, I love it. It's good stuff. And we got the King's coronation coming up, so that'll be a lot of fun, right? We have a new king, so
That's true. That is
the
true.
UK will be back. All right, buddy.
Yeah.
Thanks for making the time, man. This was great.
Likewise, Mark. It was good catching up with you.
No, it
And
was
I
great catching up with
love
you, man. I'm
what you're
glad
going
you're
to go.
doing well.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
See you, buddy.
See you.